Hello and thank you for attending my PowerPoint presentation on Seele, the first limited 5-star, and how to buff her. Seele is the first limited 5-star. She was top tier for a pretty good while until power creep intensified. She was a key player in the story of Belobog, and honestly, for having two brain cells fighting for third place, her narrative is really interesting. She is an obvious parallel to Bronya, where Seele is the shadow to Bronya's light, in a sense. Bronya is educated, elegant, but prone to overthinking everything, while Seele on the other hand has 3 brain cells, unruly, is strong in combat, at least canonically, and is headstrong and resolves everything with violence. Only by trusting each other and working together can they both reach their full potential. As an aside, can I just talk about how she is like the only person from Belobog that has like superpowers of any kind? Like all the other Belobog characters, aside from elements being infused into their attacks, all the other Belobog people are just regular humans, while Seele has like the ability to go invisible at will and what seems like teleporting based on her introductory cutscene, disappearing among the sea of butterflies, and also being fast enough to cut a bullet in her introductory cutscene, which is not human levels of reflexes. Literally no one else in Belobog has special powers like this, which is somewhat understandable considering they're far behind from the rest of the universe in terms of progress because they've been isolated for the past 700-ish years. But Seele just has these superpowers with absolutely no explanation whatsoever from her character story, or even any mentions about how strange it is that she's the only one that has superpowers. They mentioned that Seele's strong in combat, yeah, that's understandable, but like, no mention of the actual powers, and we're just supposed to gloss over it? Anyway, in combat, Seele is the original Infinite Turn character before Aglaia showed up. She's been holding up surprisingly alright until fairly recently. And speaking of which, since HoYoVerse mentioned that they'll be buffing older characters, I'll also talk about some buffs I propose to make her good again. It'll probably not be accurate in the slightest, and I'll probably completely miss the mark with balancing because I have no way to playtest, but it's fun to think about. In terms of base stats, it is just the core identity of the hunt as usual. She is the fastest character in the game to this day, and has a respectably high attack and basically no buff to speak of. If I were to buff Seele, base stats are a pretty good place to start because although I don't really know if there's like a limit to how high you can push the base stats relative to all others, but if there isn't, I buff her base attack to like 737, which is the same as Clara and Argenti, which is currently 5th to 6th highest in the game. This is a pretty significant buff that would also make attack percent more potent. Her basics are basic. They deal damage equal to 100% of her attack to a single target. It generates 1 skill point and 20 energy, which is identical to most other basics. Her skill gives her 25% speed for 2 turns. Then it deals damage equal to 220% of her attack to a single target. This costs 1 skill point and 30 energy. You should use this to pick off weak peons that aren't quite in range for a basic attack, or reasons that will become quite obvious in a bit or are already obvious if you know her kit already. This is honestly really weak. This is the same scaling as Boot Hill's enhanced basic. And Boot Hill is primarily a break DPS. Granted, Boot Hill doesn't have as many self buffs like damage percent or res pen, but he does give himself 150% crit damage, so do what you will. Either way, it's still incredibly low by modern standards. I personally buff it from 220 all the way to 420% scaling, which is on par with 1 ratio skill plus 1 ratio follow-up at level 10 scaling. When using a basic skill or ultimate to defeat an enemy, her talent gives her 80% damage bonus for 1 turn and gives her an extra turn. Note that this is gain an extra turn, not set AV to 0. This extra turn is unique in that it takes priority over most ults. If you're at the part where you're making the decision for this extra turn, which is say when you want to click basic or skill during this extra turn, any ult you use, including her own ult, will be pushed back to after the extra turn. This is the only extra turn in the game to work this way. Also, buffs given during this extra turn will not tick down at the end of the extra turn. This means that if you use, say, her skill, and during the animation, before the enemy's health actually drops to 0, that small window of time is the only time you can click ultimates if you want to use that ultimate before Seele's next turn. One thing to note is that if you steal her kill with Ramei's talent or Robin's additional damage, it will not trigger this extra turn. If I wanted to buff this talent, I would first allow it to trigger whenever an enemy dies in any way during her action. Basically, it just makes it so that the kill can't be stolen. If I wanted to push it further, I remove the restriction to allow her to chain turns. It's not like she can chain 4 or 5 turns in a row anyway, because she needs skill points for that. If I wanted to just go overkill or just for fun, I could remove the restriction on her attacks entirely. Just let her take an extra turn whenever any enemy dies in any way at any time. That would be hilarious, although probably pretty broken. Her ult first enters her talent's buff state, which gives her 80% damage bonus, and then deals damage equal to 425% of her attack to a single target. This costs 120 energy. 425% multiplier is incredibly sad. I mentioned earlier that Rachel's skill into follow-up is 420%. This is an ultimate that costs 120 energy. Personally, I buff it to at least 500%, conservatively speaking, 600% if I wanted to push it, and 700% to go absolutely overboard. For a scale of reference, 510% is Rachel's ult into one of his follow-up attacks, and 700% is Fei Xiao's ult multiplier. Her talent gives her stealth for 20 seconds. While stealth, Seele can't be seen by enemies. When actively attacking enemies to enter combat, she immediately enters the buff state from the talent. Keep in mind that this does not give her an extra turn even if she somehow kills an enemy with this. Also, this state won't be retained if you switch characters. Her E2 trace reduces her aggro multiplier by half when under half health. This doesn't quite reduce the chance of her getting hit by half, but it's slightly less than that. Generally speaking, it decreases it from 1/5 chance to get hit to 1/9 chance to get hit if you're using 2 harmonies and an abundance, or about 17% chance to get hit to about 9.6% chance to get hit with 2 harmonies and a preservation instead. Her E4 trace gives her 20% quantum res pen while she's in her buff state. Her E6 trace advances her next action by 20% when using her basics. She also gets 28% attack, 24% crit damage, and 12.5% defense from minor traces. If I were to buff her, I'd rework her E2 entirely. I understand that back in 1.0, sustains were pretty bad, so this was a much needed help in survivability. Like back in 1.0, the best sustain was like Bailu, and your only other option is Natasha. But nowadays, we have Aventurine, we have HoYoVerse, we have Lingsha, who are way better sustains. So we don't really need her E2 trace anymore. And her E2 trace is also actively bad in that she has a lesser chance of getting directly targeted for more energy. So personally, I'd replace it with like maybe her skill speed boost also gives her 10%, or maybe if you want to push it, 15% Defignal to stack up better with the quantum set. E1 gives her a 15% crit rate when dealing damage to enemies under 80% health for that attack. Her E2 allows her skill to stack up to 2 times. Her E3 gives +2 trace level to her skill and her talent. Her E4 regenerates 15 energy when defeating an enemy. This means that she can guarantee an ult in 3 skills if 2 of them take kills. Her E5 gives +2 trace level to her ult and +1 to her basics. Her E6 inflicts Butterfly Flurry to the target of her ult. When that enemy is hit by an ally attack, she deals additional damage equal to 15% of her ult damage to the target. You know, disclaimers, this is a thought experiment and is frankly not going to be accurate or even balanced in the slightest, unless the stars align to spite me again like they have with my past 2 videos. Note that I don't want to make her kit too complicated like modern characters. I still want to kind of keep the essence of her kit, but not actively give her like walls of text. I'll do this in 3 stages. Stage 1 is to make her a solid tier 1 pick on par with characters like Ratio or MOC. First up, increase her base attack from her solid 640 to a high 737, on par with Clara and Argenti. This allows her to hit harder with all of her attacks and makes attack percent buffs more effective. Then increase her skills multiplier from 220 to 420, which is again on par with Ratio's skill into follow-up. And again, all multipliers for this section will be at level 10 scaling. Then increase her ult multiplier from 425% to 500%, which is slightly lower than Ratio's ult plus 1 follow-up that has a combined multiplier of 510%. Then we rework her A2 trace entirely from the aggro decrease it currently is, and change it to my earlier proposed speed boost from skill now also gives 10% depth ignore, to stack up more depth ignore with the quantum 4 piece. This also does stack up with the 2 stacks from her E2. Stage 2 is to make her a meta on par with like Yun Li in MOC. Granted, Yun Li isn't exactly top tier, but it's about the power level of Yun Li. I should also now mention that each stage also encompasses the buffs from the previous stages. On top of the buffs you see on screen, there's also the completely reworked A2 trace, the increased base attack and whatnot. So the 2 buffs I will put in stage 2 is to buff her ult's damage multiplier from 425% currently to 500% in stage 1 to 600% in stage 2. 600% multiplier is equal to a 10 hit all on Misha, although that probably means nothing to at least 90% of you because I doubt anyone watching this actually uses Misha. I certainly don't. Additionally, her talent can now chain extra turns, which again I don't think will be broken because she still can't chain like 4 to 5 turns because you need to save up like 4 to 5 skill points. And these 4 to 5 turns can't attack this single target boss. And so it just doesn't seem broken to me. Stage 3 is intended to be just completely overkill. This is just for a fun thought experiment. Her talent now triggers whenever any enemies dies for any reason at any time. So now she just gets extra turns if other allies kill enemies on their turns. Like AoE characters can give her like 4 to 5 extra turns. That would be hilarious. Additionally, the buff also now extends its duration by a turn every time it's gained repeatedly, so that every single one of these stacked turns can actually gain the damage buff. Now to increase our ult's damage multiplier even further, from again the current 425% to 500% in stage 1, to 600% in stage 2, to 700% in stage 3. This might be a bit overkill, because 700% is on par with Fei Xiao's well-known to be strong ultimate. Let me know what you think about the stage 1 and 2 buffs, because frankly I have no idea whether I went overboard or not enough, and while you're there you might as well discuss what buffs you'd give yourself. Currently Seele is just completely underwhelming in all fronts when it comes to combat. Her damage output and her multipliers are so incredibly outdated, hence HoYoVerse's intention and my suggestions to buff her. Despite being the only feature 5-star quantum DPS so far, she is still basically completely unusable against quantum weakness because her damage is just that outdated. But I will say that she's incredibly fun to use in Simulator and Divergent Universe with the hunt to take truly infinite turns. At that point, it's not a turn-based game, it's a Seele-based game. I know that joke isn't original. Alright, thanks for watching and I hope you enjoyed. Again, let me know what you think of this video at the buffs that I proposed in stages 1 and 2 and what PowerPoint or video in general I should make next in the comments. I do read all of them. Alright, bye!